Hello everyone, happy Friday, and thank you for joining me on yet another edition of BrainScratch. Today we're going to go into the mystery of the Sodder children, and for this one we're going to turn back the clock a little bit. This is a case that happened on Christmas Eve, 1945, and still to this day generates all kinds of media, different videos, news articles, NPR interviews, all kinds of stuff. It's a mystery that, quite frankly, the world is not ready to let go of, and we're going to take a look at it today. Before we get started, I wanted to give a quick shout out to my researcher on this, Christy Straciner. Thank you so much, Christy, for doing this hard work of pulling this case together. And it's very challenging. Researching any case is its own type of challenge. But this case is particularly challenging because of how old it is. What I found in a lot of the research that I have done on this case is there is a pretty static story of this case that you keep hearing time and time again, and it's sometimes difficult to find new aspects or new pieces of information that might contradict that main story. Basically, the main story is so well known and repeated that you could be reading articles at completely different sources and they're almost copying each other word for word. That being said, I know not all of you might be familiar with this case, so I'm going to retell the story one more time. Christy was nice enough to put together a timeline. We're going to go over a bit of that. And just to start with, so you have a bit of an understanding of the cast of characters here, you have the parents, George and Jenny Sodder. George came from Italy when he was very young and found a career here in the U.S. As a truck driver, and then transitioned that into his own business of hauling coal. They had 10 children total: Maurice, who was 14, Martha, who was 12, Louis, who was 9, and Jenny, who were 8, as well as Betty, who was 5. They are the 5 children that actually disappeared or might have succumbed to a fire at the home on Christmas Eve 1945, and that's a bit of where this mystery gets fuzzy. But they also had children: Sylvia, 2, George Jr., 16, John, 23, and Marion, 17, that was actually living with them. They had one other son, Joe, who was away with the Army. So real quick, we're going to jump to the Wikipedia just to give you a little taste of what this is all about. Late on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia, United States, a fire destroyed the home of George Sodder, his wife Jenny, and 9 of their 10 children. 4 of those 9 were rescued, and the bodies of the other 5 were never found. The Sodders believed for the rest of their lives that the 5 missing children survived. The Sodders never rebuilt the house, instead converting the site into a memorial garden to their lost children. In the 1950s, as they came to doubt that the children had perished, they put up a billboard at the site along State Route 16 with pictures of the 5 offering a reward for information that would bring closure to the case. It remained up until shortly after Jenny Sodder's death in the late 1980s. And here's a pic of it, but I've actually got a bigger picture. Here we go. And in researching this, you bump into a lot of people that actually saw this sign at some point, and that is a big part of the reason why they were inspired to look into this case. There are people that specifically remember this sign. I did a lot of reading on web sleuths who, throughout the 2006 to 2008 years, had a big rise of what armchair detectives that were looking into this case. And there were people there that could honestly remember the sign and had forgotten the family's name, but they specifically remembered that sign. The sign was there for 40 years. So there's a lot of people that were exposed to it. And it was also said to be very emotional. If you got out and took a look at the sign, you'll see that it's only a few feet off the ground here. And if you're walking up to it, those children's faces are basically staring right back at you. What's also curious to see is there's actually 6 pictures here, and that's because of this extra picture over here that might be Louis, but we're going to get into that mystery a bit later. Let's continue on the Wikipedia. George disputed the fire department's finding that the blaze was electrical in origin, noting that he had recently had the house rewired and inspected. He and his wife suspected arson, leading to theories that the children had been taken by the Sicilian mafia, perhaps in retaliation for George's outspoken criticism of Benito Mussolini and the fascist government of his native Italy. Worth noting, I think it was only a year after this that Mussolini was pulled out of power. So despite George maybe having a bit of a popular or unpopular opinion among the American Italian immigrants, it seems like he at least was on the right side of history. But, you know, political discussions can certainly turn ugly when you have people of very strong different opinions. State and federal efforts to investigate the case further in the early 1950s yielded no new information. The family did, however, later receive what may have been a picture of one of the boys as an adult during the 1960s, and that's where that sixth picture comes up from. And actually, if we jump over to the Charley Project, they have an entry here specifically for Louis Errico Sodder, but at the bottom here is the photo that showed up. And there was some writing on the back of this photo. The words, Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ill boys, ILIL, which a lot of people have been questioning what that means. I haven't been able to find any strong information. Some people think that it's slang for little. I'm not sure. And then A90132 or possibly A90135. Now, in the Web Sleuths review that I did, a granddaughter of the Sodder family was adding a lot of information, and she was saying that her mother seemed to recall the back of that photo, and that it was not A90132, but that it actually said age 32 or 35. And, you know, if you kind of look, that could, of course, A is going to be an A, the 9 could be a G. Depending on the script and the handwriting, the 0, you know, if someone does an E in lowercase and they don't complete the hoop right, you might have that look like a 0. I'm not sure about the 1, but the other theory is that this is actually a postal code that ties back to Italy, which apparently has been verified that there are some postal codes in Italy that use 90132 or 90135. So, big question is this picture really Louis? One interesting aspect of this case, they have mentioned in Wikipedia here, in October of 1945, a visiting life insurance salesman, after being rebuffed, warned George that his house, quote, would go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. He attributed this all to the, quote, dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini. Another visitor to the house, ostensibly seeking work, took the occasion to go around to the back and warned George that a pair of fuse boxes would, quote, cause a fire someday. Once again, George was puzzled by this observation since he just had the house rewired when an electric stove was installed, and the electric company had said afterwards it was safe. There's another interesting thing about the electricity that comes up. In many of the retellings of this story, people note that the lights were working in the house. Christmas lights were on outside the house as the fire was going. So if it was an electrical fire, those lights should have been out. And knowing that they have fuse boxes here, that would lead me to believe there are multiple circuits within that house, and I don't believe that that is a true statement. I believe that one of those circuits could fry, start a fire, and the other circuits could still function properly for a considerable amount of time. So I'm not really sure. People seem to use that as an excuse to believe that there is something else odd going on here, and I'm not quite seeing it. And they're trying to say that, you know, this clearly wasn't an electrical fire, this was arson because the electricity was still working. I think there is a pretty good case to be made for the fact that one circuit could start a fire, but the others could be working properly. So we're going to jump back to the email from Christy and go over the timeline that she has put together. Here we go. At bedtime on Christmas Eve, 5 of the kids were too excited to go to bed. They asked their mother if they could stay up a little later, and she said yes. a little later, but they had to remember to turn out the lights, close the curtains, and lock the doors. Then at 12:30 a.m., apparently the phone rang. The mother woke up, and a woman was on the other end of the line asking for someone that Jenny didn't know, a man's name. She tells the caller that they have the wrong number. She can hear dishes clinking in the background and people's voices. Woman laughs strangely and hangs up. Mother then notices that all the lights were on, the doors were unlocked, the curtains were open. The kids were always good to do what she said, so this surprised her. She closed up, noticed one child asleep on the sofa, and assumed the others were upstairs in bed when she went back to bed where her 2-year-old daughter slept. About half an hour later, something hits the roof and rolls down. This is thought to have been the bottle of napalm-like substance that was found broken in the rubble after the fire. I believe it was one of the daughters, and it was several months after the fire, found what looked like some type of green, broken, rubbery substance. And from what I've seen, the father assumed that was some sort of napalm bomb. I haven't seen anything that was an official explanation. I haven't even seen a picture of the actual item, so it's kind of difficult to know. And the other tricky part about that is that they found that item several months after this had occurred, and in between that time, actually only 4 days after the fire, the father brought in a bulldozer and basically leveled the area there, just added a bunch of dirt on top of the burned down house, and they converted it into a memorial by planting a garden there and then eventually putting the sign up near the road. So I'm really not sure that piece of bottle could have showed up at any point in the following 3 months. It could be a part of some type of fire ignition system that started the fire that night. I can't say it's not. But that little piece of broken bottle is a bit of a point of contention for me. The house caught fire around 1:45 a.m. and burned to the ground in less than 45 minutes. After the house caught, 5 of the family members made it to the front. This is where Mr. and Mrs. Sodder, their 2 older boys, John and George Jr., and 2 of their daughters, Sylvia and Marion, had wound up. Marion had tried to use the upstairs phone to call the fire department before escaping the house, but the phone was not working. And here we get to that man that stole the block and tackle. Speaking of which, I wasn't totally sure what a block and tackle is. Did a quick Google search here, and it's a mechanism consisting of ropes and 1 or more pulley blocks used for lifting or pulling heavy objects. And you can see there's some pictures of modern ones up here. This is a bit of an interesting aspect to this case, because you have a man who admits to cutting the phone wire, though he thought it was the electrical for the house. He's stealing from the house. He apparently is fined, but it doesn't seem like he's investigated very thoroughly. And you have to believe this is either the worst run of luck for this family, that they happen to have an electrical fire start on a night when a thief is literally prowling around their house, and his intent was to cut the electricity to the house. You also have to wonder, if he's stealing something, why is he thinking of cutting the electricity? Why wouldn't he cut the phone? I personally, if I was into that type of thing, would be much more concerned about them calling the authorities or calling someone for help, as opposed to them being able to turn on the lights. But who knows, maybe he was planning on going inside the house. I'm not sure. The other thing is, look at the price of these block and tackle sets. This does not appear to be a very expensive piece of equipment. So very odd that this character is involved on this specific night with all this other stuff going on. It just really racks my brain a bit, and it seems like it's too much of a coincidence. It's a bit too much going on there. Not to mention the fact that we know that the phone was working around 12:30 a.m. We know that the house is on fire at 1:45. So literally in the exact same time frame that this house fire is starting, there is someone skulking around outside there. So it's really surprising to me that he wasn't looked into a bit harder. So back to the phone call. So Marion tries the upstairs phone, it doesn't work. She also ran to a neighbor's house and tried to use her phone, but the operator could not be reached. A passing motorist who saw the fire also went to a nearby tavern, tried to call, and at the same thing happened there. Basically, the operator couldn't be reached. Eventually, someone got through to the operator, and they were able to contact the fire department. Mr. Sodder tried to break the windows of the house to climb back in and find the children. The flames were too much. He cut his arm. Apparently, the stairs were completely engulfed at this point. You couldn't go up the stairs, so he was trying to figure out a way to get to the second level. He ran to get his ladder, which rested at the back of the house, but the ladder was gone. They later found the ladder far away from where it usually was. I believe it wound up in a ravine or something. I saw some articles pointing to that the guy that cut the phone line might have taken the ladder to get up, because it was apparently the phone up on the phone pole 14 feet high that he had to get to cut the phone line. So I've seen some speculation that that's how the ladder got moved. Mr. Sodder even tried scaling the side of the house, but he couldn't make the climb. He and his sons went to get their dump trucks to move them to the side of the house so they could climb on top of them and gain entry, but the trucks wouldn't start. It is thought this could have been from the cold weather, even though they had worked just fine hours before. I'd also found some information that perhaps they flooded the engine, just they were nervous. They were trying to start the truck, and maybe if they were hitting the accelerator too hard when they were trying to start it, they might have flooded the engine. Some other people seem to think this might be another side effect of the guy that was skulking around outside, that he might have disabled the trucks in some way. All outside water sources were frozen from the cold weather, and the town operator had to call and wake each member of the fire department, which took quite a while. From what I understand, they used a tree system, so I'm not sure about that one, how many phone calls the operator had to make versus how many calls were going on between the fire department once they started their phone tree. By the time they got there, yeah, it is worth noting that this took several hours. The fire department apparently didn't show up until after 7 a.m. And the fire station was only 2.5 miles away. However, this is a time when the country was at war, a bunch of men were gone off to battle, and I believe the fire department was comprised of a lot of volunteers. As a matter of fact, I saw some notes that the chief of the fire department had to wait for someone that could actually drive the fire truck, that he wasn't even aware of how to drive the fire truck to the scene. After finding no bodies, the fire department ruled that the fire was caused by faulty wiring. The coroner ruled that the children had perished in the fire and burned to ash. And that's where most of the conjecture in this case comes from. There is a lot of people that think that there is no way that the bodies could have been completely burned. The fire moved too quickly. According to the witnesses on site, it took about 45 minutes for the house to collapse. Some other people say that that doesn't mean the fire was necessarily out at that point, that the fire could have burned for hours, and we know that the fire department didn't show up for 5 to 6 hours after this fire started. Overcome with the grief at the loss of 5 of his children, 1 week after the fire, Mr. Sodder bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the basement with the intent of making the site a flower garden memorial for his children. Unfortunately, this also destroyed any possible evidence. And here, she put together a list of suspects. We got the insurance guy we've already covered. We've got the guy that was asking for work, that saw the fuse box and talked about there being a problem, that we've already covered. Here's a guy we haven't mentioned yet. Only days before the fire, a strange man was seen watching the house when the children got home from school. He was also spotted several times sitting in his car beside the highway not far from the Sodder home. To this day, no one knows who this man was or what the relevance to the case is. Here's another one that's kind of interesting. A bus driver claimed he saw fireballs, quote, fireballs, being thrown onto the roof not long before the fire began in earnest. After the fire, a round green object determined to be some variation on a napalm bomb was found in the wreckage. The thud and roll Miss Sodder heard on the roof, question mark. And there are some people asking questions about how she knew what she heard was on the roof. This is a multi-level structure. We're not really sure what the sleeping arrangements were. If she was on the upper level, it would make sense that she could hear something on the roof. It is worth noting that part of the roof was aluminum, so if it was something that had hit the aluminum piece, that would be a pretty distinct noise, and you would know that that came from the roof. An organ was found at the site by F.J. Morris, the fire chief. The organ was found to be cow's liver. This is a really interesting part of this case. The fire chief essentially said that he had found what he thought was remains of one of the bodies, and that he put it in a box and reburied it on the site. He confesses this to his local priest, and someone else catches wind of it as well, and it gets back to Mr. Sodder. Well, Mr. Sodder goes and confronts him, eventually gets him to show him where it's buried. They dig it up, they get the thing analyzed, and it turns out to be cow's liver and recent. So it's thought that this was completely planted by the chief just in some type of hope that the Sodder family would find it and maybe finally have some closure to their family, being killed on site as opposed to being missing. Some bones were found in the wreckage years later, but only bits and pieces, determined to be that from a 16 to 22-year-old man, and they hadn't been touched by fire. The oldest missing boy was 14. It was believed the bones were buried near the house long before the fire took place and had no relevance to the incident. I've also seen some theories that the dirt that was brought in to cover up the basement might have come from some place where these bones came from. And it's most important to notice that the bones should have obviously been scorched. There was no scorching. And of course, the age of the person that the bones came from doesn't seem to be a match. Coal trucking at this time was under pressure from the Italian mafia, and George was outspoken on his feelings towards Mussolini. He also owned his own coal transport company, and that coal was sourced nearby. Therefore, a lot of people thought they were involved. The mafia thing seems to be the strongest theory from people that believe that the kids were actually abducted. I do have to say I bumped into quite a bit of information by people that thought that the kids did also just die in the fire, and that this fire could have just been an electrical fire. Well, if you thought things were strange there, things only get stranger. This is from SmithsonianMag.com, who I highly recommend you check out this article. It's very well written, and it covers the story in depth and includes some information that the Smithsonian apparently has and had collected at the time. Then came the reports of sightings. A woman claimed to have seen the missing children peering from a passing car while the fire was in progress. A woman operating a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, some 50 miles west, said she saw the children the morning after the fire. I served them breakfast, she told police. There was a car with Florida license plates at the tourist court, too. A woman at a Charleston hotel saw the children's photos in a newspaper and said she had seen 4 of the 5 a week after the fire. The children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all of Italian extraction. Never heard that before. She said in a statement, I do not remember the exact date. However, the entire party did register at the hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow me to talk to these children. One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me. I sensed that I was being frozen out, so I said nothing more. They left early the next morning. In 1947, George and Jenny sent a letter to the FBI and get a reply from J. Edgar Hoover. Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau. Hoover's agents said they would assist if they could get permission from the local authorities, but the Fayetteville police and fire departments declined the offer. I did hear that later they were able to get the FBI to investigate for a few years based on the assumption that this was a kidnapping that was crossing state lines. But the FBI basically gave up after 2 years of chasing down leads that led nowhere. Next, the Sodders turned to a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley, who discovered that the insurance salesman who had threatened George was a member of the coroner's jury that deemed the fire accidental. He also heard a curious story from a Fayetteville minister about F.J. Morris, the fire chief. Although Morris had claimed no remains were found, he supposedly confided that he discovered, quote, a heart in the ashes. He hid it inside a dynamite box and buried it at the scene. We know how that came out. Turns out to not be a heart, but to actually be a liver from an animal. Over the next few years, the tips and leads continue to come. George saw a newspaper photo of school children in New York City and was convinced that one of them was his daughter, Betty. He drove to Manhattan in search of the child, but her parents refused to speak to him. In August of '49, the Sodders decided to mount a new search at the fire scene and brought in a Washington, D.C. pathologist named Oscar B. Hunter. The excavation was thorough, uncovering several small objects, damaged coins, a partly burned dictionary, and several shards of vertebrae. Hunter sent the bones to the Smithsonian Institute, which issued the following report. And this is where we get into the information about the bone fragments, and they are too old to be from the children that were actually missing. Here we have a picture of the wanted poster that the family created and circulated. You can see they're offering a $5,000 reward. They actually upped that to $10,000 as the years went on. Here we've got pictures of all the children. So really for me it comes down to a question of the fire and could it really destroy those remains. So I just did a little bit of searching about how hot a fire would have to get, and this is just off of a Google search here. How hot to cremate a human body. The casket or container is placed in the cremation chamber where the temperature is raised to approximately 1400 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. After approximately 2 to 2.5 hours, all organic matter is consumed by heat or evaporation. The remaining bone fragments are known as cremated remains. So you can see that takes a considerable amount of energy getting it to 1400 to 1800 degrees, but also time of 2 to 2.5 hours. So what about house fires? How hot do they get? Well, I ran a search on that, found some info on this Yahoo Answers, which I always take with a bit of a grain of salt, but there are several answers that point to the same thing. Typically, I would say a common house fire would run about 1000 to 1400 degrees, although, as others have stated, they can run in excess of 2000 degrees. And I think what we have to consider here is other potential accelerants. I did hear an interview on NPR about this case. I'll include that in the links below, where an eyewitness that was around at the time, not an eyewitness to the fire, but someone that was familiar with the area, said that George stored oil drums close to the bottom of his house. And if those caught fire, I believe that could raise the heat exponentially and also help that fire move quickly. We know that the house was a wooden structure, so that is very flammable just in its own right. But once again, I have to think of that sustained heat. You need to not only get it that hot, but you have to keep it that hot for a few hours for those remains to completely disintegrate. Worth noting, George's wife conducted her own experiments where she was trying to burn animal bones for years and years after, and supposedly she was never able to get the bones to completely disintegrate. I've also seen some people comment that the teeth should have still been left behind and no teeth were found, which I find a bit interesting also. So Stacy Horn did this really good piece on NPR. As I said, I'm going to include that in the links below, but she also did a follow-up blog with some of the information she couldn't fit into the NPR piece, mainly because the NPR piece was only 8 minutes long. One of those pieces of information that answered a big question for me was about that phone caller. There's a lot of people, and honestly, I've seen the story of the phone call be told a few different ways. Some people say that the woman calling laughed on the phone and that Jenny Sodder found that odd and was putting this together after the fire and thought that whole thing might be part of what was going on. Well, here we see the caller who made the wrong number was found by the police and questioned. She was just a neighbor who made a wrong number. The guy who stole the bait and tackle was arrested and paid a fine. But outside of that, I cannot find any information about his identity, and one of the articles I saw specifically said that his identity is not known, which, if you're looking at a potential conspiracy theory in this, I have to look firmly at that guy. Either that or he has incredible timing to hit these people at exactly the wrong time when their house happens to be catching on fire, and cutting their phone line so that they can't get help for themselves, and missing his original intent of cutting the electricity, which would have saved them supposedly from the fire. There's just something about that part of the story that does not sit well with me at all. One more thing I dug up was on this picture, and I'm really just curious about this picture being this boy. I found a YouTuber here. His name is TV-Medium. He does claim to be a clairvoyant. However, interestingly, he makes this video which has nothing to do with psychic information or him making any type of predictions. He does something kind of common sense here, and I thought it would be worth your time. So let's check out what he's got.
The Face app, that is called Faceshine app, tells me that the two photos, two persons, perhaps are the same person. It tells me that it has 84% likeness. And I tried to use it with my own children and myself, and the best percent that I could get was 36.
So I looked into this Faceshine application, and it's really made as a bit of a novelty. It's made as an app where you can, see if you look like a celebrity or something like that. But they do state that it is pretty accurate when it comes to this type of facial analysis. I did some more research on this type of facial analysis to see how strong it is, and apparently that technology has really taken some huge leaps over the past few years. All that being said, I don't know how much stock I can put into this information. So that is where I'm at with this one. Honestly, the thing that really stands out to me is this crook that happens to be on the scene at the same time that this fire is starting. Maybe he started it. Maybe it was an accident of something he was doing outside that started it. Outside of that, other theories where I've kind of let my brain go: is the father involved in this some way? Why did he cover up the scene only 4 days after? I don't think that's a very strong theory, because he spent a considerable amount of the rest of his life chasing down leads, building the memorial. But did he do all that out of guilt? I suppose it's possible. I don't have a lot of strong feeling towards that. But I did want to mention it just as a potential theory. I believe if the children really were kidnapped, and you're talking 5 kids now, one of them would have come forward since. I mean, we're now looking at this case over 60 years after the fact. There's a very good chance that all these kids are no longer alive as it is. But the fact that one of them wouldn't have written a letter or made a deathbed confession or even tried to escape that situation well before this, I find that really, really odd. These are kids that were, yeah, they're young, but they're old enough to have memories of that family. It's not like they were taking at a young time before their memory was really functioning well. You have one of these kids that's 14. So, I don't know. I'm kind of curious why that never happened, and I think that points me back in the direction of they probably died on site there. The fire department, we know that it was volunteers. We know that they only looked for remains for a few hours. Obviously, they don't have the type of technology that we have nowadays. They might have overlooked some things that could be seen as remains nowadays. But on the flip side of that argument, you have the family going back there, finding coins, finding a dictionary. I mean, shouldn't that dictionary have burned up? They also mentioned several household appliances that they were able to identify. So it really comes down to, can you believe it? Can you believe that that fire got hot enough and burned long enough to disintegrate those bodies? Why did no one hear the children scream when the house was on fire? There's some reasonable explanation for that. If there was smoke inhalation, that could have actually taken the kids out before the fire ever got to them. And that might explain why nobody heard them calling for help. Some people have asked why they didn't smell a body being burned. Apparently that's a very distinct smell. And at this blog that Stacy put together with her remaining information, she speaks to some fire professionals, and they say that unless you're downwind of that, you're really not going to smell it, and you're not going to want to be downwind of a fire that is burning that hot, because if you're downwind of it, you're basically catching that heat as well. So I also highly recommend that you check out this article that Stacy has put together. Once again, it's all in the links for you. And once again, thank you to Christy Straciner for putting all this together and for supporting the show. And she's also a Patreon supporter. Thank you so much, Christy. Really appreciate your time on this, and thank you for joining me on this edition of BrainScratch. I'll catch you on the next show on the Geek and Dorks channel. Take care.